The challenge we put up, even for ourselves, in trying to find this is that there are toponyms at the crossing site. You know, it's camp at YAM SUPH, near Bel Safan, Migdal, and pi-hahiroth is in there too.
Yeah, I mean, the Egyptian approach has these toponyms, but they claim that these toponyms are so strong, these connections to these Egyptian places are so strong, that means it has to be at the border lake, for example, at Bala Lake. But then you notice that each location that's been proposed here, each has their own Migdal, for instance. If they put it at Bitter Lakes, they say, well, then there was a Migdal there. If they put it at Timsah, there's a Migdal. Bala Lakes, there's a Migdal. You know, so
and possibly there was.
Right.
Because there were forts, right? A Migdal was seen as an Egyptian fort.
Right. But Glenn Fritz and others have given those words kind of a broader meaning. They say a tower could be referring to the towering heights of the mountains behind them and so forth. And that would have to be the case if you're in this mountainous area, if there was no fort there. It's possible there was a building that was a watchtower or a fort, but we don't know of any. We do know of those sorts of buildings here. But the problem is when you look at some of these toponyms, they're not as solid as they seem, because in some cases they don't fit the biblical narrative. For example, they're not between Migdal and the sea. The text says they were to camp between Migdal and the sea. Well, at Bala Lakes, they wouldn't have been between the fort and the sea. They would have been, the Migdal's on the wrong side of the water.
Yeah, yeah. And we did all the, a lot of people don't realize when we make the films, we're trying to get the exact maps. Sometimes we use archaeological dig site maps, and we rebuild the cities from that.
Right.
And that was the curious thing, is that the fort was opposite. It was on the other side of where they would have crossed.
Right. And in other cases, you have some of these toponyms that didn't exist at the time of the Exodus. Now, if you put the Exodus at the time of Ramses in the New Kingdom, then some of these were here. But what if it was earlier? What if it was in the Middle Bronze Age, as the first film seemed to indicate? Well, then there's other ones like Bel Safan. The site that David Roll favors for Bel Safan wasn't there for 1,000 years after the Exodus. And so how does that really work as a place name to fit with the Exodus itinerary if it didn't even exist at the time?
I suppose people would argue that, well, maybe it wasn't as well known, but or did it not exist at all?
As far as we know, it didn't exist at all. It's not a case of the name being updated. It's a name. It's a case of it not existing at all. So that becomes okay. That's your place name. Well, that place wasn't there. There wasn't a temple to the god Baal at the time of the Exodus, as far as we know. So is that really good evidence or not?
Yeah.
And so some of these sites were not existing at the time of the Exodus. Some were in the wrong place, and then others are just. Does it really mean that Egyptian word? I mean, does that have that Egyptian meaning? For example, does YAM SUPH really mean the Sea of Reeds? Does it really connect to Pa-Tufi or Pa-Chufi, the place of reeds that was known to exist, along in Bala Lakes and areas to the west? So that's all part of the debate. But I think a lot of people realize that these toponyms, some of them we might not know what the true meaning was or where they were, and we might never know. And so that's, I think, why the Hebrew view would put more emphasis on the things that we can know more clearly from the text, and that is the descriptions of the events and the itinerary and all the information that we have.
And the fact that it's a geographical puzzle.
Right, right. And the place names are just one little part of that puzzle.
Yep. And one of the big parts of the puzzle, which is very disturbing for many people in the Egyptian approach, would be the sea that is crossed. So, because on the other side of that sea is where the mountain is.
Right.
And so the question then is that most people have been comfortable for a long time, hundreds of years, maybe 1,000 years, with one of these areas like the Gulf of Suez, is the sea that is crossed. Because then that naturally puts Mount Sinai where everyone has considered it to be, in the Sinai Peninsula.
Right. And one interesting point is, if the crossing was over here, it is still possible that Mount Sinai was in Midian.
Yeah, that's true.
But once you put the crossing here, that really forces Mount Sinai to be on the other side.
Then it's pretty much a done deal.
Right.
It was the meaning of words. The biblical text gives place names for locations along the Israelites' journey out of Egypt. Words like Sukkoth, Etham, Mara, pi-hahiroth, Migdal, and YAM SUPH. What were these words describing? And were these words connected to real locations that could still be found today?
Now, how does that fit into the Exodus itinerary? What do you think?
Well, what interested us is that in Exodus 14:2, one of the places said to be close to the point of the Exodus was a place called pi-hahiroth. Pi-hahiroth, if you break down the various elements, pi-hahiroth means the mouth of the canals. That word harot is an Akkadian Babylonian word for canal. This is a man-made feature, not a natural feature. And so suddenly the realization that there was a canal on the frontier of Egypt became something very interesting to us. Secondly, in association with pi-hahiroth was the name of another site called Migdal. And Migdal means fortress or tower. Why that becomes significant is that Migdal is mentioned on that relief of Seti I we saw from Karnak Temple.
But would the other locations have been called Migdal, Fort, Orion, or Fort Horus, or Fort, Migdal?
The names of the forts seem to vary based on the type of fort they were.
Okay.
So, for instance, the fortress of Charu, the main fort, was called a chetem. Chetem is a Semitic word meaning seal. Two different meanings are thought to come from that. One, it's a place where you entered Egypt to have your documents sealed. Foreigners were filtered through this, channeled through this area. Here's where you get your documents checked. Another interpretation is that it was to seal off. It was an area that was naturally controllable by the Egyptians because of the waterways and so on, that it was a place where people had to pass through. Either way, the meaning would be similar. So the Chetem fort had a separate function. A Migdal fort, one might think, had a larger, higher tower to look out, to see advancing enemies, that sort of thing. But one thing is clear, that usually the king's name, the pharaoh and power's name, was attached to it. So in the Seti relief, it's called the Migdal of Seti I, the reigning pharaoh. In later papyri, when Ramses II was pharaoh, it was called the Migdal of Ramses. So the name changes to adjust to the current monarch, but whether it's Migdal or Chetem fort, those stay the same.
Okay.
So we have a potential location for YAM SUPH, the Sea of Reeds. We have Migdal, we have pi-hahiroth. That's the compelling evidence that this is the location.
What would pi-hahiroth mean?
This we don't know. I cannot enter on that.
Okay.
It's P. It's again. It seems to be Per. I mean, could be an Egyptian name, but I cannot embark on this. This is too speculative for me.
So where do you think the crossing of YAM SUPH is?
Well, I certainly don't think it's in this area over here, the Gulf of Aqaba, and I don't think it's in the Suez area. All the toponyms point to one location, and that's immediately to the east of the delta over here. So we're right in the northeast of Egypt.
Are you suggesting that the place names are more accurate in this area?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing is the evidence of the ancient texts. So we have texts that tell us that Baal-zephon and Migdal are in this area over here. And we know that the crossing point is between those two locations. So it has to be up here. We don't have any evidence of any other Migdals or Baal-zephons anywhere else. So it tells us immediately we're in this area. We can't look anywhere else.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that it makes the most sense that the place names right in these areas all fit what the Bible is saying.
And they are the primary piece of evidence. Texts are always going to be the primary piece of evidence. Ancient texts tell us where these places are, therefore we got to know that this is the area where the crossing point was.
Okay, so let's get specific. Where are these biblical locations?
Okay, well first of all we have Migdal, which is a fortress in this region here. There are numerous fortresses here, but most Egyptologists will pinpoint this location here. Baal-zephon is probably Tel Dafana today, which is a site over here. It was a city, and it had a big temple for Baal-zephon located there. So it is to the west of Migdal.
So Baal-zephon.
Baal-zephon, yes, the god Baal.
Okay, we've heard about the god Bel and other.
Baal-zephon simply means Baal of the Northlands. That's what it means.
And the name that's Arabic now, and this is what is it called?
Tel Dafana, or the Mound of Dafana. Now, the ancient Egyptian name was Takpenes, which again is very similar. So all these names have very, very similar sounding to them. The Greeks call it Daphne. So they all have this very similar sound. Zephon, Zaphne, Daphne, Dafana, they're all very similar. So most people would say, most Egyptologists would say, that this is the region where Baal-zephon was located. And this camp is opposite a place called pi-hahiroth. Now that means the mouth of the canal. In Egyptian, it's Pachara, the same name, the same sounding name. And we know where that is as well, because we have, in this Bala Lake system here at the northern end, we have the mouth of a canal that goes across the desert in this direction here, which was like an extra frontier. So the Israelites would have been on the opposite side of the Bala Lakes, waiting to cross over, and the mouth of the canal is on the opposite side.
Yeah, so you have all the place names mentioned here.
You do, and you don't have them over here in Saudi Arabia. This is why this is such a strong area for believing the Yam Suf is located here, because all the toponyms, the names of these places, are in this region.
But others in the Egyptian approach have other ideas about the locations of these sites. At the University of Liverpool, I met Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen, who is one of the first scholars I talked with in 2002. He favors the Bitter Lakes.
Now, do we know where some of these other places are? Migdol, pi-hahiroth, and Pharaoh talking about the wilderness hemming them in. What do we know about this? I think the answer is not a lot. Exploration of the delta is still in its infancy. It's not like the Nile Valley, which is much easier to dig, you see. And new work is being done. There's BTAC at one point, Hoffmeyer at another point, and these people are beginning to unearth evidence for different places occupied then. And very recently, Professor Hoffmeyer has got a site of all sorts of broken remains of the days of the Ramesses kings, which might possibly be Migdol or one of these neighbouring towns, Migdol or pi-hahiroth.
I don't know where Baal-zephon is. I don't think anyone does. It's a Baal is the name of a Canaanite god.
Yeah.
And so it's probably not an Egyptian word. And Saphon is a regular word for north. Saphon is a, you have like north, south, east, and west.
Yeah.
Zaphon means north. And so I assume that this is a place that was maybe named when the Hyksos were living there. I'm surmising.
Yeah.
It's not an Egyptian word. It's obviously a Canaanite word. It's the identification of a god. Naming cities for gods very common. Pithom is the house of Atum as a god. Ramesses is for the god Ra. I mean,
Ra,
he's named for Ra, and so forth and so on. So it's not unique to have a city named for a god, and that occurs elsewhere.
Professor Beitzel shared some more information about the canal that was found in the northeastern Nile Delta along the border of Egypt.
Now, there was a canal in Egypt that has been traced up. It goes, you can see that I've got it, but it's a canal that runs from Timsah the whole way up through here to Bala, and then it goes from Bala the whole way up into the area of Pelusium. In terms of the dimensions of the canal, those that are known, and mind you, not all of that canal can be known today because big parts of it have been carved away with the creation of the Suez Canal. But what we know from what has been found, it's probably about 10 feet deep. Sounds like it would have been about 10 feet deep. At places it was as wide as 200 feet at the surface and maybe as narrow as 65 feet at the current water table level. Okay. The question then becomes, is that canal, does the word pi-hahiroth mean the mouth of a canal? If so, is it that canal or is it some other canal? I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anyone knows the answer to that. If it happened to be that canal, what does that mean in terms of the logistics of the crossing of the body of water? I don't know what that means. It's easy to ask those kinds of questions, but we don't have any basis for finding evidence for that. So we have to, there are questions that are, I don't know, tantalizing to pose, but for which there are no known answers.
Baal-zephon is tough. There's been speculation all over the place. It seems to be the god of the north or the god of the sea. I have placed it right at Pelusium, because even though there wasn't Pelusium at that time, this is a promontory, a prominent landmark on the shore of the sea, and that seems to be where the storms come from, so I've just placed it there.
Okay.
So that's my idea for facing Baal Zephon across the way. Now, you notice in the Bible, they never, even though they're facing Baal Zephon, they never reach it. That would be true here as well. They're facing it, and it is in the direction of freedom and life for them. But they go across here, and then they immediately go south to the South Sinai. They never actually reach Baal Zephon. So that's just a conjecture on my part, based on just the location and the description in the text.
They faced where they came from.
Glenn Fritz uses similar thinking for Baal Zephon, along with the Hebrew meaning of pi-hahiroth, as mouth of the gorges, to orient the upper entrance of the gorge of Wadi Watir to the north. Significantly, those in the Hebrew approach point out that there are 7 verses locating the biggest biblical place name of all, YAM SUPH, at the Gulf of Aqaba.